Hello everyone and welcome to another really wild game from round 7 of this year's St. Louis Rapid tournament. It's Alireza Firouzja versus Nepomniachtchi. Alireza has been leading the tournament so far after day 1 and day 2, even after that loss to Fabiano Caruana that we've shown. Other than that, he's been having a spectacular event, but Jan is doing fairly well himself. And this game is just, like I said, really wild. Alireza manages to surprise Jan very early on with a nice Semi-Tarrasch, and Jan just all of a sudden is down the exchange already on move 8. So let's see how this happened and how the game continued. So Alireza opens with d4. We have knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, and d5. So a standard queen's gambit declined. Knight to c3 and c5. Jan goes for the Semi-Tarrasch, and now we have e3. C captures on d5, still the more popular, but Alireza goes for e3, knight to c6, and now pawn to a3. We have d captures on c4, bishop captures, and pawn to a6, now preparing b5, and there are some games that reach this position, quite a lot of them actually, where castles was played. Also bishop just back to d3 is a known move, d captures on c5, offering a queen trade is a known move, but here Alireza plays bishop back to a2, and it is now as of move 8 that we have a completely new game. So how can Jan react to this? Well, of course, his plan was b5, and as Alireza did not stop it, he will execute b5. We have queen to c2. Alireza offers a pawn here, and Jan says, all right, let's see what you got, and he accepts the challenge. He plays c captures on d4, e captures, knight captures, and queen captures on d4. And now, what was Alireza's plan here? Well, his plan was knight to d5, and already we have some fireworks on the board. The queen, of course, cannot capture the knight, as the bishop covers that, but you could capture with the pawn. However, then queen to c6 check, and you might lose a rook. So how do you play this? It's actually incredibly sophisticated, and in order to survive this, you have to play queen to e5 with check. Jan didn't play this. Jan played knight captures on d5, but I will show you because it's really an incredible line. Queen to e5 check is what you have to play, and now after bishop e3, knight captures on d5, and now queen to c6 with check. And now check this out. You cannot play king to d8, even though it seems like a reasonable move. If you play king to d8, you just get obliterated. Bishop captures on d5, rook to a7, so black kind of keeps the rook into the game, but now queen to b6 with check. Now attacking the rook, and after rook to c7, now bishop to c6, preparing rook to d1 check. So here bishop to d6, and now you're gonna castle queenside, bring a rook into the attack, and after bishop to d7, you're just gonna play f4, and here black would resign. There is no move for the black queen. Once the black queen moves, of course, you're just gonna capture on d6, and that's it. There's no move the black queen can make here that'll be in any way useful. So what you would have to do after this queen to c6 check is actually play king to e7, and now after queen captures on a8, you're gonna play knight captures on e3. Of course, if captures, then capture. So first one check, queen to e7 with check, and only after king to f6, you're gonna play f captures on e3. Now your queen is defending the e3 pawn, but now bishop c5 attacks the queen, and the e3 pawn still hangs, and now castles with check. This is really wild stuff. King g5, and now queen to a8. The queen can now get back into the defense, and even though you could capture on e3, you're just gonna allow this rook to come into the game with tempo. So best is just best is just f5. The black king will have some safety there, and this should be good for black and white also. So that's the idea behind the position and what Alireza prepared for Nepo. But Nepo just plays knight captures on d5. He says you can have your rook. Let's see what you got. So queen to c6 check, king to e7, and queen captures on a8. We have queen to e5 with check, king to f1, and now Nepo just plays queen to d4, the threat being queen to d1 checkmate. So how can Alireza stop this? Well, bishop to g5 check. Now the rook covers the d1 square, so he's not gonna get checkmated. King to d7 only move, otherwise your bishop on c8 just hangs, with queen captures on c8. So here bishop captures on d5, the only way to fight for advantage. queen captures, and now you trade queens. Captures, and rook to d1. And here, Alireza says... all right, I'm up the exchange. You're up a pawn, and you do have the bishop pair, but at some point I'm gonna play h4, bring the rook to h3, bring the rook into the game, and it should be a fairly easy win. So bishop to b7, we have bishop back to e3, and now Jan executes pawn to b4, stopping Alireza's pawn to b4, and also activating his dark square bishop. So a captures, bishop captures, and now bishop to d4. Alireza gets his bishop to this long diagonal, even though h4 also could be considered, as you want to get this rook into the game as soon as possible. And now we have rook to c8. Jan not interested in wasting time defending the g7 pawn. He just brings the rook into the game. He has the bishop pair. He wants to play bishop c6, bishop b5, put this bishop on this diagonal. This bishop will control this diagonal, maybe even this diagonal in the future. And if the rook comes to c2, should be very unpleasant for Alireza. And Alireza says, all right, I agree. I'm not going to go after the pawn, and he plays h4. Now rook to h3 is coming, and now rook to c2. Jan again does not defend the pawn, and here you could go after the pawn, but if bishop captures on g7 now, then you no longer control this diagonal. And now how do you defend rook captures on c2? There is one good way, but it's not bishop to d4. If you play bishop to d4, then just bishop captures, rook c1 check, and you lose the rook on h1. So instead of this bishop retreat, you would have to play king to g1, actually allow the capture on f2, and after rook captures on f2, now threatening all sorts of nasty discoveries, now bishop to d4. Now the threat is king captures on f2, so now bishop captures on d4, rook captures, and now rook captures on b2, and you would get this endgame to rooks against the bishop and rook, but Jan would be up 2 pawns. So white should be better, but not enough to actually win. So instead we have rook to h3, and now finally g6. Now Jan says, all right, you've spent all your moves developing, I now have to defend my pawn, and then f5 is coming as well. So rook f3 attacks f7, Jan plays pawn to f5, and now pawn to h5. Trying to trade off a pair of pawns here, and then maybe even open up the h file for the rook, maybe put the rook on the g file to attack the pawn. So here we have a5, and now h captures on g6. H captures on g6, and now rook to g3, just going after the g6 pawn. And here, Jan defends it with a very, very neat trick. Bishop to a6 check, king to g1, and now bishop to e2, with tempo attacking the rook on d1, and now preparing to shift the bishop over to h5 to defend the g6 pawn. So rook to a1, and now bishop to h5. And now how can Alireza make progress here? The b4 bishop defends the a5 pawn, the h5 bishop defends the g6 pawn, and the king will very likely defend the d5 pawn. So here, Alireza goes rook to d3. He might have some ideas of moving the bishop and going after the d5 pawn, and at some point even bishop to c3 might be an option. So here bishop e2 attacks the rook, rook to e3, and Nepo repeats bishop to h5. But now we have rook to e5. This is a very nice rook lift for Alireza. King to d6 defending the d5 pawn, and now rook to e8. At least this way Alireza gets his rook activated. King d7 kicking away the rook, rook to b8 now. We have bishop to e2, waiting to see what Alireza will do, and now rook to b6. Also, you could go after the pawn via the g6, the g8 square, but Alireza decides to go for rook to b6, and now just pawn to g5. Nepo advances it. Maybe rook to g8 was better, as this also would prevent pawn to g5. So here, rook to g6, going after the g5 pawn, now just pawn to g4. And here, finally, we have bishop to c3, offering a trade of bishops, which will also remove the defender of the a5 pawn. And here, what do you play? A very interesting idea, and this you would have to be very, very ambitious to go for this, and really want to fight until the every last pawn, is to play rook captures on c3, b captures, bishop captures, and now you would have a bishop pair against a rook pair. You would be up 2 pawns, that including the passed passed D pawn and the passed A pawn, and it could get ugly. For example, you put your bishops on B2 and B3, and you are controlling all of these squares. It's very easy to start promoting this pawn. White would have to give back at least one rook. So here, instead of this, Nepo goes for bishop to C5. Now he wants to put pressure on F2, and now we have bishop captures on A5, rook captures on B2, and now bishop back to C3, attacking the rook. Rook to B3 attacks the bishop on C3, and now bishop back to E5. And here, the position is fairly equal, and if you play something like bishop to D3 or bishop to B5, then chances are this would just end up in a very quick draw. However, Nepo played bishop to C4, and here Alireza actually has a winning position, but it's very, very difficult to win it because you have to really see it. And also Alireza was incredibly low on time. He only had seconds on the clock, whereas Nepo had, I believe, maybe even close to 10 minutes, as Nepo usually plays fairly quickly. But feel free to pause the video and try to find this spectacular position that Alireza missed while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding this brilliancy. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook to A8. We can even do a slow rook lift as it goes all the way up to the board. And now that you see it, of course, you again believe it. Now there is no defense for black. Whatever you play, just rook to G7 check, and that's it. This rook controls the entire 8th rank. Rook on G7 will control the entire 7th rank, and the king will be forced to one of these two squares. Of course, you can't go here. The bishop covers that, and that's going to be it. To give you an example, let's say rook b1 check, king h2, and rook captures on f2. Seems like white is getting destroyed here, but just rook g7 check, and that's it. If you go to e6, rook to e8 is checkmate. Very unfortunate. The bishop is defended by the rook now, and of course both of these squares are covered by the bishop, so that's it. And if you go to c6, it's not much better. Just rook to c8 with check, and now how do you play this? You have to play something. You can either go to b6 or to b5, but whatever you play, the rook on b1 will hang. So for example, king to b5, just rook to b7 with check, and now even if the bishop goes back to help out with the defense, just rook captures on b6, and after king captures, just rook to b8 with check. Now the king has to move, and now of course the rook hangs. Rook captures on b1, and that's it. So that's why rook to a8 in this position, absolutely spectacular, but Alireza misses it. He was convinced that it was a draw. He played rook to d1, and now indeed it is a draw. And here bishop to d3, stopping the attack on the d5 pawn, rook to c1, attacking the bishop, bishop to c4 by Jan, rook d1, bishop to d3, rook to c1, bishop to c4, and rook to d1. And it was in this position on move 46 that Alireza and Jan agreed to a draw, as there is now nothing more to be done here. So really wild game. I'm pretty sure Alireza surprised him with this bishop to a2 move, and then just Jan went into this pawn grab and allowed the queen to c6 check, followed by this rook capture, even though you've seen the line that instead of capturing queen to e5 check, and then that complicated line where your king ends up who knows where on h6, on h5, you're going to play f5. I mean, absolutely crazy position. But yeah, Alireza did outplay him, but that's the easier part, because usually everyone outplays Jan, but then Jan just outplays them back, and then it's either a draw or Jan wins this, or very rarely he actually loses. But yeah, he has shown the power of the bishop pair, the power of activity, the power of well-placed pieces, and it was just also this was a really beautiful move here, where Alireza just played bishop to d4, attacked the g7 pawn, and he just played rook to c8, showing the power of the bishop pair. Like I said, going here, and just rook to c2. This is definitely worth a pawn, and well, in the end, the result is fair, even though Alireza had a win, and a beautiful win in this position. So I thought, yeah, you might find it useful for your own games. You might have a similar position where you might be able to take away the 8th and 7th rank from your opponent's king, and okay, maybe it's not going to be exactly the same, game, but you know, patterns, patterns, and patterns, and you know, in the end, you will win some game using those patterns. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to wish a very happy birthday to Lenny, and I would like to thank Connor Kelly, John Merlino, Damon Targaryen, and Girish Sharma for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the St. Louis Rapid event until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day. And if you have any of your own favorite games, do share it using hashtag suggestion in the comments. See you soon.